Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. And today I'm joined by Katherine Stewart, author of the new book, Money, Lies, and God. Katherine is a journalist and an author whose work focuses on the intersection of religion, politics, and policy, or as you put it, everything your mother told you not to talk about. Katherine, welcome to The Politics Guys.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I love getting to have authors on the show. We do this regularly. I love it, in large part because I just love getting to read new books. It's an excuse to have to tell people I'm doing work. I have to read. And so I did enjoy your book. And so there's a lot going on. But one of the starting point for your book, Katherine, is that we need to be very thoughtful about the right, and specifically the Christian right, because unlike, say, in times past, as you put in your book, we can't just tell the story of two sides, because one story, the big story, is that there is an actual anti-democratic movement in the United States, and that it sits firmly with, say, the right Christian nationalist group. And so Take our listeners through a little bit of how you arrived there at the starting point for this book.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the title, Money, Lies, and God, because these three features are a huge part of the story of American politics today. So first, money, because huge concentrations of wealth at the very tippy top of the economic spectrum have really destabilized the political system in some interesting ways, and I get into all of that in the book. Second, lies or conscious disinformation is another huge feature of this movement. And number three, God, because the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is Christian nationalism. And, Christian nationalism, to be clear, look, there are a lot of people who are Christian who object to religious nationalism in the way that it's being deployed in our politics. I want to make it clear that, that we're not talking about Christianity. This is not a religion. This is a political movement that is really all about politics and power. It certainly makes use of religion, but it's the exploitation of religion for political purposes.
I love that you went there, and I'd love for you to go to that, because you call it not a political ideology or an ideology. You actually call it a political pathology in your book. So explain to listeners, as you start to say there, like, listen, Christianity is separate from Christian nationalism. So explain, what is the pathology then, in your view, of Christian nationalism?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that we have to understand religious nationalism or authoritarianism, frankly, as something that happens to a political system, rather than something that starts off as a full-fledged political program that receives majority support. So when I suggest that the anti-democratic movement overall is more pathology than program, What I really mean is that it has a number of different pieces and interest groups, sometimes working for different aims, but these groups nevertheless end up reinforcing one another. You have the funders of the movement, you have thinkers of the movement, you have very political pastors, religious activists, you have the rank and file who are voting for the political candidates that the movement favors. And these groups are sort of actually sometimes have different aims, different interests, but they're rowing in the same boat in a sense. But the outcome of their collective actions, I would say, could have really unpredictable and lead to consequences that many of the rank and file who are lending their support to this effort don't really anticipate or want. I mean, religious nationalism is an exclusionary form of nationalism. It's the idea that a certain type of people get to properly belong in the country and others do not. There's the sort of virtuous, true Americans who have the right political and religious orientation and everyone else. And this is explicitly, is very an un-American idea. It's not the idea of America that our thinkers like Thomas Jefferson or Frederick Douglass or Lincoln had in mind when they and so many others helped form the country that we have today.
Well, one of the ways you put it in the book that made me think for a minute was you talked about the idea of America. It's you didn't use the word battle, but it is a competition between America, the idea, and America, the religious, cultural specifics, right? In other words, you're attesting to some of those to be Americans. Is that what you're getting at here?
Yes, I mean, America's the idea that they have about America was not founded on the ideals of equality, the idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, leaders who are accountable to the public, laws that should be deliberated in public, but really the idea of a country based on a religious and ethnic heritage, right? And a very specific interpretation of religious heritage. So, for instance, there are a lot of faith leaders today. I'm thinking about the Baptist Joint Committee, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, Vote Common Good Network, the New Evangelicals. So many other American Christians are saying this ideology, this movement does not represent what we endorse. It doesn't reflect our understanding of the Christian faith. But, if you go into the way I do a lot of my research trays, I go into sort of Christian nationalists and far-right spaces. I go to strategy gatherings and conferences and things like that. And you hear speakers deride progressive and moderate Christians as heretical and disparage the social gospel. So these are really important elements of Christianity for many, if not most, American Christians. And yet they too are under attack by this movement and its leadership.
Well, I couldn't help recently, I guess it's been about a month or so ago, I had the opportunity to interview Jim Wallis here on the Politics Guys for his new book, The False White Gospel. And I couldn't help but notice some similarities between what you were doing in your tome and what Jim was doing in his book. Only as you were putting it there, and I wanted to get to that, you seem to be kind of coming from an outsider's perspective, right? So Jim Wallis is kind of here is the theological problem that's wrong with, white Christian nationalism. And you kind of are coming into it as a reporter. And so you have these, sometimes beautiful little vignettes, sometimes stomach-turning vignettes in the book where you've been places, and you describe that. So walk us through, some of the locations you've been. I'm thinking about when you headed and did the dinner, and everybody's all together and ready, and they're all dolled up, and they're going on social media. You have some just very fascinating vignettes on that front. So could you share some of those moments, from your kind of investigative part of this book, those journalistic moments?
Yes. As an investigative reporter, I feel like you need to be on the ground and see what's happening to really understand the features of the movement. So I'll just tell you about a few people that I've met along the way. And by the way, I think we need to make clear up front that this is a leadership-driven movement. The movement is not led by the rank and file. The attitudes of the rank and file are shaped by the leadership. So I'll just talk about some of the members of the rank and file that I've met that have really shined light on different aspects of the movement. So I think you might have been referring to the Moms for Liberty gathering that I attended. And, all of these women are there, they're raring to go, they're mama bears, they're defending kids in public schools. But really the aim is to destroy public education, to foster mistrust in public education in order to sort of prepare the ground for a wholesale assault. Now, to give you a bit of backstory, I'm a public school mom. I do believe that in public school libraries and in curricula, you should have age-appropriate material. But what they'll do is they'll find some little thing that either, exists in some way that it doesn't exist in public schools, or they'll take some little tiny thing and they'll tar the entire public education experience with this one little thing that they don't like, and they throw out a lot of babies with the bathwater, so to speak. So they're really not out there to improve public education. They're really out there to bash it. So I'm sitting in at this beautiful breakfast with this beautifully dressed lady, and I asked her, how did you get involved in this movement? And she told me her story. She said she was involved in a kind of very tangential way in the anti-abortion movement. She signed some petitions, etc. But she didn't really become active until she heard that a particular book was in a public school library. And I said, well, which book is that? And she said, it's The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. And if you're familiar with the book, I sort of struggled to what is the problem with it? It's a very moving book about a 13-year-old girl who her diary when she had to hide in Nazi Germany, and then she was, later killed. And I said to her, what is it about that book that disturbed you? And she said to me, the lesbian scene. And
I'll be honest, when I read that, I actually had to, I saw your quote, there's this moment when they're going to touch, and I've read the book. I couldn't remember that to save my life.
No, because it's not memorable. She has a moment with a best friend of hers, and they're pledging their friendship, but it's not a lesbian scene. No lesbian activity happens. But it's a couple of words in a really powerful book about the Holocaust that really activated this lady. And I can promise you, it's not that she was reading the book and found those lines. It's like she heard from the Mama Bear Activist Network. Like these are all, this is not a movement driven by the sort of grassroots, even though they claim they are. This is an organization that had deep ties to the Republican Party from the first. They have funding and other forms of support from some of the major organizations of the religious right. And they have these activists who comb through whatever material they can find and say they're teaching this in kindergarten when maybe they're teaching in high school, or they're finding something and amplifying some kind of fake thing about it in order to deploy the politics of outrage. So this was an illustrative experience for me because I thought, well, here's this nice lady. If you really start probing her, you'll definitely find some homophobia. You might find some anti-Semitism, kind of, even though she'll probably claim she's not, but you might find that. But the real thing is that, she's been subject to this propaganda campaign. And this is where the lies fits in the title of my book, Money, Lies, and God. There's been this tremendous campaign to disinform a large sector of the American electorate, to deploy the politics of outrage for politics, to make people angry and resentful, to make them feel like they're being persecuted, and they hurl those resentments against their political enemies. So that's one of the stories that really struck me. There was another lady I met at the Reawaken America tour. Do you know what the Reawaken America tour is?
I don't know.
It's a traveling pro-MAGA conspiracy fest. They set up all around the country in mega churches. Each one draws thousands of participants,
Now,
Mm,
you wrote about that in the book, though. Yes, I remember you
right.
talking
In
about
Las
that. But no,
Vegas.
that was the first time
Right.
reading your book was the first time I had encountered that term. So it was the
Yeah.
reawakening. That's right. Yep. Yep. Continue,
It's called
please.
Reawaken America. Sure. And I met this lady who was her life was troubled. She was pretty emblematic. A lot of the people you're going to find at Trump rallies, she was struck, she's on the lower end of the economic spectrum, but she's not poor, but she's an independent business owner. She's struggling to pay her bills. Because the cost of housing is going up, the cost of, when she was young, her parents could probably afford to buy a house. Maybe her mom didn't have to work for a few years while the kids were young, but she's like not there. Right. Her marriage is falling apart. She's got one kid who won't talk to her, which I can't imagine how painful that must be. I sort of started interrogating her, and she said, I think they got to him. And I said, who? And she said, the homosexual agenda. So here's a woman who has some legitimate gripes, not about the homosexual agenda, which isn't targeting her. It's the billionaire class that are supporting this agenda that is actually making life harder for families like hers to succeed, eroding rights for the workforce, not addressing things like the rising cost of housing, the sort of thinning out of public services that people actually need. But this movement has told her there's an enemy to blame. It's the homosexual agenda. It's those evil woke liberals who want to change your kid's gender against their will, which is not true, but that gives her a convenient target for her rage. And the movement is very good at cultivating that kind of rage and then hurling it at political enemies. And let's be clear, Trey. Some of the sort of excesses of what people call woke, sure, is some of it silly? Do some of the DEI programs bear closer scrutiny? Of course. But what this movement is trying to do is much bigger than that. They're using this as a justification for a wholesale assault on our democratic principles.
Well, as I read your book, I couldn't help, especially, and that's why thank you for presenting those, a couple of the vignettes. But one of the things as a social scientist that I was wondering that at the macro level, and you've said it here, is the idea that the rank and file, the followers, they aren't their grievances are disconnected from the donors and from the sergeants who are kind of pushing these things forward. But my question for you on a macro level was, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that those kinds of propagandas aren't uber successful. But that seems to be kind of what your book is predicated on. So what makes you think that the nice ladies maybe don't actually mean what they think? In other words, that they've been propagandized. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, you just have to look at the vote. If you look, the movement leaders recognized decades ago, if you can get people to vote on one or two issues, you can control their vote. And that's why they devoted so many resources into turning the Republican Party against abortion. Abortion is a really important issue for them. It touches on issues of family and gender, and sex, which makes everybody pay attention. And, it's very interesting because we have to remember when Roe versus Wade passed in 1973, most Protestant Republicans supported it. The Southern Baptist Convention actually published two editorials in 1971 and 1974 affirming support for abortion law liberalization. Barry Goldwater, that great conservative hero, he supported abortion rights, at least early in his career. His wife, Peggy, co-founded Planned Parenthood in Arizona. Betty Ford called the passage of Roe versus Wade a great, great decision. I'm quoting. It really took a lot of effort to turn the Republican Party against, to flip them on the abortion issue and to purge pro-choice voices from the Republican Party. And who wrote a great book about that process, and it's worth reading to show where it came from and how far it went? Phyllis Schlafly. She wrote a book titled How the Republican Party Became Pro-Life. And what that book shows is it took a lot of effort and it took a lot of years. And they did it for political purposes. It's a modern, the sort of pro-life party that we see today, and the Republican Party is a modern creation, and it was created for political purposes. So I do think that those propaganda campaigns, we can say that that's agitation on a culture war issue, but there's all kinds of propaganda campaigns that have been enormously successful. I mean, look at the lie that the 2020 election was stolen. A great number of Americans actually believe it. You can look up the studies, what percentage of the country would legitimize the political violence. If Trump should have lost the 2024 election, it's a really shockingly high number. I want to talk about another propaganda campaign because it really relates to what we're seeing today in our politics with President Trump and his billionaire co-president, Elon Musk. There's been a tremendous propaganda campaign against government itself. So when Americans are surveyed about the level of waste and fraud in government, they always come up with these sort of ludicrously exaggerated estimates. It's not to say that waste and fraud don't exist in government agencies. They do. Just there's room for improvement, as there is in the private sector. You could maybe lose, 5%. If some agencies are 10, make everybody work harder, they'll still function. But people need to be reminded of the very good things that happen when government functions. And they need to be reminded of the very bad things that happen in countries with kleptocratic, cronyistic governments, or those with an absence of effective government.
Well, let me ask you about that because our interview comes at an apropos time in the connection between Donald Trump and Russia, right? So just a couple of days ago, because you do seem to be making the argument in the book that one of the we've seen these patterns elsewhere in other kinds of far right movements. So what do you think about like the comments? The misinformation comments from President Trump as it relates to President of Ukraine right now, him starting the war and being a dictator. And then earlier today, for a matter of fact, Musk, as you brought him up, arguing that is in fact, the polling numbers aren't real. Donald Trump's numbers are in fact real. Do you see that as part of the package that you've laid out here? Obviously, that's newer than your book, but.
Absolutely. I mean, that sort of use of lies and propaganda. But the main thing we're seeing, frankly, is a serious downgrading in the competence with which basic government functions are handled, including our foreign policy. I mean, there are so many illustrations. Think about Pete Hegseth giving away the barn before he sits down at the table, or Vice President Vance needlessly offending allies and taking sides with far-right parties in Germany.
AfD, yeah.
The whole Doge fiasco of firing the people who actually handle nuclear weapons and then disseminating classified information on semi-functional websites, and then, of course, the purging of prosecutors and other FBI and justice officials, which is bound to be a shining example of adverse selection at work. The competent people who've done their jobs and did their duty are the ones being removed. So, that's one level. And it extends to foreign policy as well. A lot of our European allies are incredibly confused because Trump who's just a purely transactional person, wants to do deals with Russia and Saudi, and he's doing some of those in direct conflict, of interest because he's got business interests with them. But, and then Marco Rubio goes over to Europe and tries to offer words of reassurance. And so our European allies are saying, well, this guy said this and you're saying this. They just have no idea what's going on. So we're seeing like this diminishment of competence and effective messaging. And that's one line of development. But the other one is laying the groundwork for epic levels of corruption. I mean, speaking of Musk, one case in point, he's the legitimate subject of many investigations for his various dealings all over the world, frankly, and he's now in a position to secure favored deals for himself. But of course, Trump and his family have also been moving with lightning speed to cash in. The most extreme example is the sale of the meme coins, which, by the way, any sort of buddy who wants anything from Trump or even the foreign government that wants some kind of favorable treatment can just pour their money into Trump or his wife's meme coins, and then, then maybe they'll get his ear. But there are other opportunities for grift in the works too. And these are, going to be these opportunities for grift are frankly going to balloon now that the Department of Justice the system of justice has really been decapitated. And of course, the president has been granted immunity for anything that he pretends is official by the Supreme Court.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
So, to bring us then back to the narrative of your text, because I appreciate that kind of answer. What, you have these different elements working together, and you point to a couple of cases, two of which I was more familiar with. One was KrisAnne Hall. I actually met her personally.
Wow.
She came to Oklahoma City. Weird but true story. I have 2 copies of her book hidden in my office because I didn't want people to think it's like see them as they walk in. Yeah, but I didn't want to get rid of them. They're fascinating little goes. And I thought you had to have like a one-off on her, but I thought she was kind of emblematic when I first met her. She had this idea then, I think it was always a bunch of hokum, but the idea that, there was going to be she was going to start a real law school, quote unquote, in Florida. And it was going to do, I think, in a lot of ways, what you track what happens with New College in Florida as occurring, right? That it's going to push out the woke, fix these kinds of things. And then, of course, you also point to states that are kind of taking that in, not just Oklahoma, but here in Oklahoma City, where I am, for the Catholic charter school, something that's been a big issue here. So walk us through some of that educational element, because it seems to me when I read your text that is where you spend, I think, a bulk of your time.
Well, public schools, really, this sort of preoccupation with public schools looms large in this movement. They've been flashpoints for the culture wars for decades. When I started researching 16 years ago, and we were living in Santa Barbara, California, a Good News Club came to my daughter's public elementary school. That's kind of the inciting incident for what got me down this path. And it was really clear to me right from the start that this is an organization that was deeply hostile to the institution of public education precisely because it was nonsectarian, welcoming all families, regardless of their religious background or their politics, neither affirming nor denigrating any form of religion, any religious viewpoint. But the Good News Club, which I started researching, and its parent organization, the Child Evangelism Fellowship, were just one small part of a larger effort to change public education as we know it. Number one, it's like a 2-pronged strategy. They want to force their programming into the public schools, as we're now seeing in Oklahoma and elsewhere. And number 2, defund public schools by diverting taxpayer money to private religious schools, which they're also, as you know, trying to do with the St. Isidore Academy Charter School, which is also in Oklahoma. And
yeah, it's right here in OKC, as a matter of fact, yeah.
Right, they want it to be a fully funded charter school. So, but if we take a step back, we can look at this as part of a long-term strategy on the religious right. Jerry Falwell made the agenda clear in 1979 when he said, "I hope to see the day when there are no more public schools. Christians will have taken them over. No, churches will have taken them over, and Christians will be running them." And other powerful religious right leaders like D. James Kennedy, who was had on a lot of different radio stations, very prolific writer, and took millions of dollars from the family of Trump's former education secretary, Betsy DeVos. He said public schools were atheistic and amoral and were brainwashing children in godless secularism.
Yeah. Well, so this this is a broader question, but it kept coming to me over and over again. On here in the Politics Guys, myself and many of the other co-hosts have talked education policy, have followed education policy, and that's obviously a big part of what you do. And one of the points that I've made, and so I'm curious, since you focus on it and you've studied this, it seems to me that one of the reasons that education ends up being a touchstone is precisely kind of what you're touching at, which is education is inherently not value neutral, especially with K through 12 students. And it doesn't seem like it can be. And therefore, it ends up inevitably going to be a fight over what's going to be the correct normative framework in which to have kiddos move forward. And so in your text, you don't seemingly take a side on that, but you are kind of implying that there might be a non-normative way to have public schools. I'm curious about your thoughts about that, because you kind of walk up to that line in your critiques of the religious right, but I'm not quite sure what the vision is on your side that would be the anti-version of it, if that makes sense.
Well, again, I'm a public school mom, and most of what my kids learned were, reading and math and state capitals and American history, which seemed very fact-based, science, which seemed very fact-based. There was very little of the ideology that the right claims that there is. And look, public schools aren't going to be perfect. Private schools certainly aren't perfect. Frankly, I think a lot of the sort of woke stuff that they're complaining about is more endemic to the private schools than the public schools, which are really intent on getting those reading and math scores up. I mean, so much of what they do is, reading, math, and test prep. But they will amplify, as this lady did with the sort of Diary of a Young Girl, the book by Anne Frank. They'll find one little thing they don't like, and then they'll go crazy. So I have a friend in Simi Valley. He teaches, I'm sorry, not Simi Valley. He's in Central Valley, California. Teaches elementary age math. And he said, all of a sudden, everything is going fine, no problems for years, just, helping these kids get, education in math. One year, all of a sudden, it's like 1 month, he's besieged by dozens of parents who are angry. They're like, stop teaching CRT in math class. And he's like, I'm teaching second grade math. Let me show you my textbooks. And he shows them his textbooks, and they all calm down. But it's because Libs of TikTok or some other right-wing account has found one thing that might be taught somewhere and maybe not, and blown it up into be this huge thing. And I will tell you another thing. As a parent, you need to be engaged in your kids' education, whether they're attending a private school, a public school, a charter school, or homeschooling. I did homeschool my kids one of my kids for a couple of years, not because the public schools were so terrible, but for other reasons. And you got to be an engaged parent. That comes with the territory. So there was in one of my kids' public schools a little brief section, maybe covering a couple of sentences in a piece of the curricula that I objected to. And I thought, okay, it's not a big part of it's in one 45-minute class, probably going to be covered in about 22 seconds in a 45-minute class. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to have a conversation with my kid about this thing because, I don't think it's really being framed the right way. And so I did. And so you just have to accept that no school is good. Things aren't perfect. No school is going to be perfect. If you find some little thing in your kid's public school, you don't shut at the schools over it. You have a conversation with your kid. If you need to, if it's like something that's literally not factual, you can have a calm conversation with the administration about it. But you don't show up at school board meetings, slash people's tires, and scream at them. It's just not the way to do it. Look, in order for public schools to function effectively in a diverse society like ours, we need to set aside our religious agendas, our political agendas, come together in support of our kids and their collective future. And public schools should be for education and not indoctrination. And that is precisely what they're trying to do by forcing their programming into the public schools, by, forcing their religious signage and sectarian and political Bible curricula and other. I mean, in order for public schools to function effectively in a diverse society, we need to set aside our religious agendas and our political agendas and come together in support of our children and their collective future.
Now, later in the book, Catherine, one of the hypotheses you float is that, in fact, the whole educational process here, at least at the funder level and the leader level, is not for those pushes to work. So it's not to actually get the books banned, but it's for those efforts to fail, so that in the failure you suggest that one can create outrage, right? And that seems to, and therefore be, I assume, the next thought there is that then legitimizes anti-democratic institutional pushes. Am I correct in that thesis as you get deeper into the text?
Yeah, mostly. I mean, they do want to get whatever those books are that they're objecting to out of whatever place that they may or not be. May not be. A lot of those books are not. And by the way, public school libraries have all kinds of books. I mean, as a mom, I was always volunteering to help load the new books that came in from Scholastic or whatever onto the bookshelves of our libraries. And I found books by Callista Gingrich and other sort of right-wing figures that are sort of promoting their understanding of how the world works. And you put those right up, next to the books talking about empathy and anti-bullying. I mean, there's just all kinds of different ideas in libraries. And of course, they all need to be age appropriate, but this idea that public school libraries are filled with pornography is simply not true. But the idea is to mobilize the politics of outrage, to create a population that is so convinced that, we're facing an absolute apocalypse, that they're really okay with the destruction of democracy, that they think the rules don't apply anymore. And the sort of idea of the permanent emergency is really a critical feature of authoritarian movements. You can see it. We could see it from, leaders from Napoleon to Mussolini. I mean, there are so many leaders, authoritarian leaders over time, who have said we're facing this total apocalypse because, the consequence of losses in the political arena are too dire to ignore. The fate of the nation is hanging by a thread. And so the rules can be suspended, the laws and constitution can be suspended. We need a strong man who's going to come in and forcibly make everything right. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, this is, I've been covering the rise of religious nationalism for many years, but the real problem here is authoritarianism. Religious nationalism, it's an anti-democratic political ideology, but it's only sort of one feature of this movement. It's a very important one, but it's a very important feature, but it's only one feature. I mean, I would say, there's a real difference between, I would say, the sort of religious right leaders, like some of the sergeants of the movement, and the funders. Like the funders really want economic policies that are going to benefit them, that are going to intensify their wealth. They want deregulation for their businesses. At the same time, they want protective policies for monopolistic practices. They also want, I'm looking at you, Mr. Musk, they also want a lot of tax subsidies for their work. So they just want to get richer. They're already super rich, some of the richest people on the planet. They want to just get richer. And frankly, that comes at everybody else's expense. But the religious right leaders, they also, see their own interests here. The funders often, if you really dig into some of them, like people like Barry Seid or Jeff Yass or some of the others, like Musk himself, some of the tech bros, are they really motivated by an end to abortion? No. Or by opposition to same-sex marriage or whatever it is? No. They really, they just view working with these sort of religious nationalists as the price of doing business. And religious nationalism, like around the world, is a great tool for authoritarian leaders. When you've got people like Vladimir Putin, or let's look at Viktor Orban, or let's look at Erdogan in Turkey, or let's go over to Iran and look at the leaders in Iran. When these leaders bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries, in order to consolidate more authoritarian forms of political power. We rightly recognize that as religious nationalism. And what these leaders are doing is, they're bubble wrapping themselves in sanctimony. They're saying, you can't touch me. I've got the holy man to my right, and I've got the holy man to my left. They're guarding against any investigation of their crimes they're committing against their own people, against the way that they may be stealing from the public treasury, the way that they're enriching their cronies. And you could describe a lot of these countries as, I would say, theocratic in a certain fake sense, and that there's an official religion, and some of their laws might be based on their holy texts. But really, they're better described, I think, as cronyist kleptocracies with absolute suppression of free speech and political opposition. So that's really what Trump would like to do. I mean, he wants to weaponize the Department of Justice and turn it into one of his, little personal police teams so they can go after his political enemies and work on behalf of himself and his cronies. And we're seeing also a decapitation of even like a lot of purges in the CIA. We've seen the dismantling of an organization that investigates sort of foreign companies or foreign interests that are coming in and their corrupt practices as related to the United States. So at the same time, I have to note, we're also seeing the destruction of a Consumer Protection Bureau that has actually saved billions of dollars for the rank and file on sort of illicit banking practices. So we're seeing a steady, slow, or not even slow, it's like a very fast dismantling of the institutions of democracy that actually serve the American people, and sort of a hijacking of those that will only serve a president and his very rich allies.
Well, as we come deeper in your book and closer to the end, one of the things that I had kind of wondered, so I finished your book and I sat it down, and we've had a big snowstorm here in Oklahoma City. And so I was sitting there in the fire and I was pondering to myself, I've read and interviewed a number of scholars and journalists who are investigating similar things to you, Catherine, but many of them are kind of trying to do it. And the target audience of their books, like Jim Wallis, is, internal Christians or people on the right. And when I came to your conclusion, and you kind of said, you call it the way forward, and you have kind of like, what do we do? Because in some ways your book, it's a downer, and I don't mean that in a bad sense, right?
Sorry.
But, yeah. But the message is, and so you're having this moment of, you're trying to have like this moment of hope. But I kind of left wondering who is the person you're hoping to convince or eye open in terms of your book? Who is the way forward directed at? Because I wasn't sure myself, and I was curious.
Well, we need a big tent. We need to abandon purity politics. We're not going to agree on what, the people who I am appealing to. It's a very broad group of people, from Republican to Democrat to third party, truly conservative, to moderate to liberal to progressive. I mean, we're not going to agree on everything, nor should we, in a country as large and diverse as ours. But if we can agree on core values, the values of equality and pluralism and democracy and rule of law, then we can and we should work together. So those are the folks that I'm trying to reach. It's a very large group. I think one of the things that's inhibited our understanding of this movement is the word conservative. A truly conservative person or movement would seek to preserve institutions of value that have served us over time. It would seek to preserve the integrity of the judiciary, the health of public education that has powered so much of our prosperity, over such a long time. It would seek to preserve some of the norms and institutions that have made us a beacon in parts of the world, in our better moments. Listen, no country is perfect. America's never been perfect, but we have these beautiful ideals of equality, the idea that, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that laws matter, that regulations matter, that a government should function on behalf of the people, and so people who sort of believe in that and would like to sort of help form a more perfect union are the folks that I'm trying to appeal to.
Catherine, thank you so much for answering that question and for being on the Politics Guys today.
Thank you. It's really a great pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much. Again, we've been talking with Catherine Stewart, who is the author of the new book, Money, Lies, and God. It is available on Amazon and anywhere books are sold. She has many others as well, and I encourage you to check those out. But specifically, today we've been talking about Money, Lies, and God. Thank you so much for listening to the Politics Guys. If you would, it is always helpful if you rate, subscribe, or review. We need those algorithms, and we appreciate it. You can also become a supporter of the Politics Guys by heading to politicsguys.com/support or heading down to the show notes. Don't forget, you'll also have a link to Catherine's book in the show notes. You can click there to buy it. And as always, if you have questions for us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. And if you're a supporter, you know that you can reach us on Discord, one of those perks of being a supporter. Please, again, don't forget to rate, and review this episode, as well as sharing those with your friends. Thank you so much. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a full new episode this weekend, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,